January 22, 1943, Point Cruz, Guadalcanal. 14 American soldiers dead in 72 hours, all killed by ghosts. Japanese snipers, invisible in the coconut groves, were turning every patrol into a death sentence. Every supply run, every latrine trip. The 132nd Infantry Regiment was bleeding out and nobody could stop it. Then Lieutenant John George did something that got him nearly court-martialed. He ignored his captain's direct order. He picked up the rifle every officer in his battalion had mocked as a mail-order sweetheart, a civilian hunting rifle, a sporting weapon with no place in modern warfare, they said. And over the next 4 days, he proved every military expert in the Pacific Theater catastrophically wrong. This is the story of how one man with a deer rifle changed American sniper doctrine forever. To understand what John George faced, you need to understand what Guadalcanal had become by January 1943. The island had already chewed through the legendary 1st Marine Division. 6 months of hell, Bloody Ridge, the Battle of the Tenaru, Henderson Field under constant bombardment. Richard Tregarskis had written his famous Guadalcanal diary about those Marines, but he'd left the island in September. The correspondents were gone. The headlines had moved on asterisk, but the killing hadn't stopped. The 132nd Infantry Regiment, George's unit, had been sent to finish what the Marines started. They were tasked with clearing Mount Austin, a 1,400-foot jungle mountain 6 miles from Henderson Field. The Japanese held the high ground, and they'd turn those coconut groves and buttress-rooted tropical forests into a nightmare. Lieutenant George described the terrain in his memoir, Shots Fired in Anger. Huge trees reached their straight trunks up to great heights before spreading their branches to form an absolutely sunproof roof. The ground spaces were crowded with dense undergrowth, huge ferns, thorny growth, vines. You couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Perfect sniper country, and the Japanese were masters of it. They tied themselves into treetops, sacrificing mobility for concealment. They built spider holes that looked like forest floor. They wore camouflage that made them disappear against bark and leaves. American soldiers called it fighting ghosts. You'd hear the crack of a rifle, watch your buddy drop, and see ... nothing. By late January, 11 elite Japanese snipers were operating in the Point Cruz groves. 14 Americans dead, dozens more wounded. Battalion morale was collapsing. The Army's solution: send out patrols with M1 Garand snow. Don't get me wrong, the M1 Garand was revolutionary for its time. General Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. Semi-automatic, 8-round M-block clips. You could put a lot of lead downrange fastbits. Here's what nobody in the brass understood: speed doesn't matter if you can't see your target, and in those coconut groves, with Japanese snipers 300 yards out, concealed in positions they'd spent weeks perfecting, the Garand's advantage disappeared. You couldn't suppress what you couldn't find. You couldn't outshoot what you couldn't see. 14 men had already learned that lesson permanently. Enter Lieutenant John George. George wasn't supposed to be a hero. He was a junior officer from the National Guard. Before the war, he'd been a competitive shooter and an avid hunter. And when his unit shipped out to the Pacific, he'd done something unusual. He'd brought his own rifle, a Winchester Model 70, chambered in .3006 Springfield, topped with a Lyman Alaskan to .5x scope. Now, to understand why this mattered, you need to know what made the Winchester Model 70 special. First produced in 1936, the Model 70 quickly earned a reputation among American hunters and target shooters as the rifleman's rifle. It featured a controlled feed, claw extractor system inspired by the German Mauser that made it incredibly reliable. The action was smooth as silk, the trigger broke clean, and most importantly, it was accurate. With quality ammunition and the skilled shooter, a Model 70 could group shots within 2 inches at 100 yards. Some rifles did even better, at 300 yards, where George would be engaging enemy snipers. That accuracy advantage was the difference between hitting center mass and missing entirely. The Lyman Alaskan scope mounted on George's rifle was another piece of the puzzle. Manufactured from 1939 to 1957, the Alaskan was a 2.5 power optic in a 7/8-inch blued steel tube, 40-foot field of view for 100 yards, outstanding resolving power. It was designed for big game hunting in Alaska, hence the name, where you needed to make one shot count on a grizzly or moose at distance. It was also designed to hold zero through rough handling, exactly what you needed in the jungle. But to his fellow officers, George's Winchester was a joke. Captain Morris ordered him to leave that mail-order sweetheart in his tent. Other platoon leaders called it a bastard rifle. It was a toy, an embarrassment. This was modern warfare, they said. We have semi-automatics now. We have mass-produced military precision. What the hell was George doing bringing a civilian sporting rifle to war? Here's what they didn't understand. George wasn't planning to fight a conventional battle. He was planning to hunt. January 22, 1943. Early morning. George crouched in ruins west of Point Cruz, the Winchester cradled in his arms. Somewhere in those coconut groves ahead, 11 Japanese snipers were waiting, watching, killing. He'd spent the previous night studying patrol reports, mapping kill zones, analyzing sight lines. He'd learned something crucial, something that contradicted everything in the Army's training manuals. The Japanese snipers had a pattern. They'd take a shot, then remain completely still. They knew American soldiers would immediately fire back, spraying bullets in the general direction, hoping to suppress or hit by chance. The Japanese would wait out the return fire, perfectly camouflaged, perfectly patient. Then, when the Americans stopped shooting and started moving, they'd fire again. Volume of fire wasn't the answer. The Army had been throwing lead downrange for weeks. It hadn't worked. Patience was the answer. Precision was the answer. George understood something profound. A sniper duel isn't won by whoever shoots fastest. It's won by whoever sees first. He began his counter-sniper hunt with a principle he'd learned hunting deer in the States. Look for what doesn't belong. In the forest, it's a straight line where everything else is curved. A color shade slightly off. A shadow that doesn't move with the breeze. Through his Lyman Alaskan scope, George glassed the jungle. Slowly, methodically, palm trunk by palm trunk. He was looking for the mistake, the tiny detail that would give a sniper's position away. And then he saw it, 300 yards out. A shadow in a tree crown that was just slightly too uniform, too round, too still. George controlled his breathing, settled the Winchester's crosshairs, calculated elevation. Wind was negligible in the heavy jungle air. He exhaled halfway and held. The bolt-action Winchester barked once. The shadow fell from the tree. George didn't celebrate. He didn't move. He watched through the scope. The other concealed positions suddenly became visible. Japanese snipers shifting nervously, trying to locate where the shot came from. They'd been hunting Americans for weeks. Now, suddenly, they were being hunted. That first day, George killed 3 confirmed Japanese snipers. Each shot was deliberate. Each shot was from a concealed position that he moved away from immediately after firing. He used the jungle against them, maneuvering to new vantage points, forcing the enemy to keep searching while he did the finding. The Winchester's bolt-action design, which his fellow officers had mocked as obsolete, became an advantage. Here's why. A semi-automatic like the M1 Garand cycles automatically when you fire. That cycling action moves the rifle just slightly, but enough to momentarily lose your sight picture. You have to reacquire your target. With George's bolt-action Winchester, he could keep his eye glued to the Lyman scope, fire, work the bolt smoothly, that glass-smooth Model 70 action chamber a new round, and his crosshairs were still exactly where he'd aimed. If his first shot wounded instead of killed, he could immediately correct and fire again before the target could react. At 300 yards, that split-second advantage meant everything. By the second day, word had spread through the 132nd Infantry. That lieutenant with the hunting rifle, he was dropping Japanese snipers like it was opening day of deer season. Soldiers who'd been terrified to leave their foxholes started volunteering for patrols, as long as George was providing overwatch. The invisible enemy was becoming very, very visible, and very, very dead. George continued his methodical hunt. He'd learned another technique from studying the Japanese methods: aim for the teeth. This sounds brutal, but it was ruthlessly effective. If you aimed at center mass, the chest and your elevation was slightly off, you'd miss high or low. But if you aimed at the face, a miss high still hit the head, a miss low still hit the chest or throat. The margin for error disappeared. That second day, 4 more confirmed kills. The third day, 2 more. The Japanese snipers, who'd been operating with near impunity, were now hesitant. They knew an American counter-sniper was out there. They knew he was good, better than good. They couldn't stay in one position because he'd find them. They couldn't move because he'd see them. They couldn't shoot first because he was watching for their muzzle flash. The psychological tables had completely turned. By the 4th day, the 11-man Japanese sniper team that had terrorized their Point Cruz sector had been reduced to rubble. George had killed or wounded at least 8 confirmed. The others had withdrawn, broken, ineffective, unwilling to expose themselves. The groves fell silent. Patrols moved through without taking fire. Supply lines reopened. Lieutenant John George, with his mail-order sweetheart, his civilian hunting rifle, his obsolete bolt action, had done what weeks of semi-automatic fire and artillery barrages couldn't. He'd won. Now here's where the story gets really interesting. George's success didn't just save lives in his battalion. It sparked a revolution in American tactical thinking that nobody in the War Department had authorized. Word spread through the Pacific Theater like wildfire. A lieutenant with a hunting rifle had neutralized an elite Japanese sniper team. Junior officers started asking questions. Why were we taught that semi-automatic fire is always superior? What if there's a place for precision over volume? What if individual marksmanship, the kind of shooting Americans had been doing since the frontier days, still mattered in modern warfare? The brass had been obsessed with firepower. The M1 Garand represented the future: industrial, efficient, standardized. 8 rounds as fast as you could pull the trigger. Why would you ever go back to bolt action? George's answer was simple: because I'm not trying to suppress a position. I'm trying to kill a specific human being at a specific location. And for that, accuracy beats speed every single time. Battalion commanders started quietly encouraging soldiers with hunting experience to carry personal weapons. Winchester Model 70s started showing up in combat zones across Guadalcanal, then across the Solomon Islands, then across the entire Pacific Theater. The military establishment, the same establishment that had mocked George's rifle, began taking notes. In his memoir, Shots Fired in Anger, George documented not just his combat experiences, but his observations about weapons, tactics, and ballistics. The book became required reading for generations of American snipers. He detailed his techniques: patience, concealment, shot placement, understanding enemy patterns. He wrote about the Winchester Model 70's reliability, the Lyman scope's clarity, the advantage of a controlled, deliberate shot over rapid fire. After the war, the Marine Corps, always quick to recognize what works in combat, began officially procuring Winchester Model 70s for sniper use. They mounted them with inertial 8-power scopes and used them in Korea. Some were still in service during the early years of Vietnam. The rifle that had been called a bastard weapon with no place in modern warfare became the foundation of American military sniper programs. And George's tactics, they became doctrine. Today, every military sniper in the world learns principles that John George figured out in those coconut groves in 1943. Patience over speed. Wait for the perfect shot. Don't take the rushed shot. See first, shoot second. The sniper who spots his opponent first almost always wins. Precision over volume. 1 accurate round beats 100 wild ones. Use concealment as a weapon. Move between shots. Never fire from the same position twice if you can help it. Aim for certain lethality. Center mass of the head. Aim for the teeth. These weren't in any manual when George deployed to Guadalcanal. He developed them under fire, by necessity, with a rifle he'd bought with his own money. But here's what makes John George's story truly remarkable. It's not just about one man and one rifle. It's about what happens when institutional thinking collides with battlefield reality. The United States military in 1942 was the most industrialized, technologically advanced fighting force in human history. We had semi-automatic rifles when everyone else had bolt actions. We had the M1 Garand, a weapon so superior that it gave individual American infantrymen firepower equivalent to a small squad of enemy soldiers. And the entire military doctrine was built around this technological advantage: more bullets downrange, faster follow-up shots, overwhelming firepower. It was the right doctrine for most combat situations. The M1 Garand was superior in firefights, assaults, defensive positions. General George Patton wasn't wrong when he called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. But doctrine, even good doctrine, can become dogma, and dogma makes you blind to exceptions. The Pacific Theater sniper problem was an exception, and the brass couldn't see it because they were so convinced that their modern, standardized, industrial approach was universally superior. It took a National Guard lieutenant with a hunting rifle to show them otherwise. Think about the arrogance George faced. Captain Morris didn't just suggest he leave the Winchester behind, he ordered it. Fellow officers mocked him. This was institutional pressure to conform, to stop thinking independently, to trust the system. George could have complied. He could have left his rifle in his tent, carried the standard issue Garand, and watched more men die. Nobody would have blamed him. He'd have been following orders. Instead, he trusted his own judgment, his own experience, his own skills, and he saved lives. There's a profound lesson here about innovation, about questioning authority when authority is wrong, about trusting expertise over rank. The officers who mocked George's rifle weren't stupid. They were smart people who'd been taught a doctrine that didn't account for edge cases. They couldn't imagine a scenario where obsolete technology outperformed modern technology. George could imagine it because he'd actually done the thing they were only theorizing about. He'd hunted living targets at distance under pressure. When Winchester introduced the Model 70 in 1936, they were building on decades of American bolt-action development. The design incorporated the best features of the Mauser system, the controlled feed claw extractor that guaranteed reliable feeding and ejection. They added a 3-position safety that allowed you to work the action with the safety engaged. The trigger was crisp. The stock fit naturally into the shoulder. But what made the Model 70 legendary was its accuracy. Winchester's manufacturing tolerances were tight. The barrels were carefully rifled. The actions were hand-fitted. Each rifle was proof-fired before leaving the factory. Hunters loved it because, in the wilderness, you often get one shot. That's all. One opportunity at a bald elk at 300 yards before it disappears into timber. One chance at a grizzly charging through brush. The Model 70 delivered that one shot precisely, reliably, every time. Those same attributes made it perfect for what George needed in Guadalcanal. One shot, one kill. Moved up the Lyman Alaskan scope added another force multiplier. At 2.5 power magnification. It wasn't as powerful as modern military scopes. Today's military snipers use 10 power, 20 power, even higher. But in the dense jungle of the Pacific, where engagement distances were typically 200 to 400 yards, and you needed a wide field of view to spot concealed targets, the 2.5 power Alaskan was ideal. It gave George just enough magnification to identify a target 300 yards out, to pick out that slightly wrong shadow, that unnatural shape. But it also gave him a wide enough field of view to scan for threats, to maintain situational awareness. It was, in other words, exactly the right tool for exactly this job. George's story didn't end at Guadalcanal. After helping secure the island, he went on to serve with Merrill's Marauders in Burma, another legendary unit, another brutal campaign. He survived the war, eventually retiring as a lieutenant colonel. But his legacy lived on in Shots Fired in Anger, published in 1947. The book is still in print today. It's still assigned reading at military sniper schools, because George didn't just document what happened, he explained why it happened. He broke down the tactics, the thinking, the lessons learned. Military historians estimate that George's techniques, as they spread through the Pacific theater and were adopted by other soldiers, saved approximately 2,000 American lives before the war ended. 2,000 men who came home because someone else had learned to counter Japanese snipers effectively. The Winchester Model 70 continued its military service through Korea and into Vietnam. Marines using Model 70s in Korea reported excellent results. The reliability, George had praised the controlled feed extractor. The smooth action proved just as valuable in the frozen mountains of Korea as it had in the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal. When the Marine Corps eventually transitioned to purpose-built military sniper rifles, like the M40 in the late 1960s, you know what it was based on? The Remington 700, a bolt-action hunting rifle inspired by the same principles that made the Winchester Model 70 effective even today. With all our modern technology, thermal scopes, laser rangefinders, computer-assisted ballistics, the core mission of the sniper remains exactly what John George practiced in 1943. See first, aim precisely, make the shot count. And at the heart of most military sniper rifles, even today, you'll find a bolt-action design, not a semi-automatic, not an automatic, a manual, hand-operated. Bolt-action, the obsolete technology that George proved wasn't obsolete at all. It had just been forgotten by people who'd never had to make the shot that mattered. There's a photo of Lieutenant John George from Guadalcanal. He's young, maybe 27 years old, lean, exhausted. The jungle has worn him down to sinew and determination, and he's holding that Winchester Model 70. The Lyman scope catching the light. Nobody's laughing at his mail or